Thank you, Joe. Good morning. Tasha, could you get the lights and we'll get started? The manure management. How many of you have spread manure? Oh, good. Yeah, I'm preaching to the choir. We're going to talk a little bit about not just spreading, of course, and stockpile and those things, but also what it means to do it properly with the implementation of a nutrient management plan, how to best develop a nutrient management plan with the use of manure. And again, my name is Dave Myers, County Extension Agent, Anne Arundel County from the University of Maryland. You're in Anne Arundel County, right in the center of it. I've been born and raised in this county, and for 18 years I was at the Naval Academy Dairy Farm as agronomist in charge of cropping. So I'll share with some of those experiences with manure handling and manure management. But beyond that, when we think about manure, let's see what we've got to do here to get this to go. First thing you might want to start thinking about is, that soil out there is not a fountain of wealth, and that's really what you're, working on in this course is develop an understanding of cycling of nutrients. And of course, manure is a very valuable portion of that. And if you look at those two maps up at the top, you'll notice that one of them has a lot of red and yellow, and what that shows is population centers in the world, and the red is the areas where the world is heavily populated. And you can see also, if you look at corresponding soil organic carbon maps, that they kind of go hand in hand. Population centers do very well where you have high organic matter soils. And of course, rainfall is involved in that too. But soil and soil development and manure and recycling, that's kind of what we've got to start thinking about. This is not a never-ending system. It's something that we have to continually be working with. It's very complex. It's like my wife says, just because you put that plastic card in the machine that hands you money doesn't mean it's always going to hand it to you forever, right? And we got to put the money in there first. And so kind of think about those concepts as we start. Of course, we're going to focus on manure, but there's other ways to fertilize. We can fertilize with commercial fertilizers, biosolids, legumes, and green crops, green manures. And of course, we end up with that, right? That's getting the most out of your stack wagon. I'm just going to mention that really it's about money too. We're talking about manure, we're talking about dollars here. We're not talking about a waste product. Years ago when I was dairy farming, when I first started out, it was seen more as a nuisance, something you just had to deal with, and less emphasis was put on this dollar value. Of course, fertilizers have popped up, and it was in the mid-'80s when my superior came to me and said, hey, your fertilizer bill is getting way too high. That 60 grand or whatever you're spending a year is too much. So let's see what we can do. And so what we really started to do is look at how much value. We're just kind of looking at this manure as icing on the cake. Not really. We were just putting it out in the field knowing that it had value, and we could see a response. But hey, that's just icing on the cake. We still fertilize the same way. Okay, and that's a wrong approach, right? That's an overburden of nutrients. So again, take a look at those budgets. I know Heather Hutchinson's probably going to go into great detail with that. Benefits and risk of using manure as a nutrient source. And of course, I don't know, maybe we've been there. Don't worry, it's all natural. The guy here fishing, and manure's kind of flailed. And we go right up to the stream banks and pond edges and all those. I think we've learned a lot over the years. It is natural. There's no, that's not a lie. Manure is natural. It happens, right? But one thing about it is we've got to recognize where it's appropriate to put it, where it's appropriate for it to end up, and that's in our crops and not in our water resources. So again, just kind of think this through a little bit more about manure management. It's valuable. It's also can be an environmental concern. I know you're talking quite a bit about that as we go through this series of studies in the next couple of days. CAFOs, Confined Animal Feeding Operations. This is a Naval Academy dairy farm. I lived up here in this house right here for 15 years with my family as I kind of grew up on the farm there. This is about 10 miles from here. Ambrose, it's still there. We had the confined animal feeding area here where the dairy cows were housed, and of course we had the lagoon right here, capture lagoon, and we had stockpiles at different, but I guess the idea is what fields typically got spread? Anyone venture a guess? Yeah, the closest one. So where do we put our most of manure? We put most of manure out of this area, probably right here, and over here, probably right in here. What about the rest of the farm, the other 860 acres? We might cover 200 of it, but what about the other 800, 400, 650 acres? It got very neglected with manure. So when you start looking at it as a resource and a fertilizer source, now all of a sudden you say, guess what? We don't generate enough manure on this farm to fertilize this acres but once every 5 years. So you start looking at it that way, so you're not overburdening some soils. And so here's the lagoon reach with an irrigation reel gun. Okay, this is the reach of the lagoon here. Okay, it might be 250 acres, something like that. And then we had 2 stockpile areas where we stockpiled the bedded manure. And again, we basically cleaned out, stockpiled, and spread out twice a year before we cropped in spring and fall. Okay? And it made sense to put them in 2 locations to really start utilizing it as a resource. At one time, we strip cropped. I had 88 fields to manage. Okay? And so we thought about, hey, once every 5 years, it gets a manure application. So we start thinking more sensibly about using these manures as fertilizers. This can all be described to you quite well in Chapter 9 in the Manure Nutrient Source book, and that's what we're going to do is look in this Mid-Atlantic Nutrient Management Handbook, look at all the different sister universities that have worked together with Maryland and, of course, other ag departments like Maryland Department of Agriculture, go hand in hand to develop this and work partners with CESRIS, which is USDA, Cooperative State Research and Extension Services. Dr. David Hansen probably did most of the slides that you're going to see, except for some that I inserted. So we're going to go over this chapter a little bit to get it in our mind what it means to manage manure and what it means from a standpoint of using it as a fertilizer. And these slides are pretty wordy, so they're for your reading later on. I know you can't read that handout, so I think you got it in your folder. I think you have the PDF, so you can then blow it up to 200, 300% and read it real nice on your computer screen. How and where is your manure stored, or generated, how is it stored, and how is it ultimately used? Manure is, I guess you could say, it's an unavoidable byproduct of animal production. I don't like this kind of term as a byproduct. I think we should look at it as a resource and start thinking of it as that way. It's not a nuisance anymore. If you're a dairy farmer, there's days when I would say, yeah, it's a nuisance. And I dairy farmed, like I say, for 18 years. But keep in mind that anyone enjoy working in manure? You afraid to raise your hand? I'm not. Well, I used to love it. So I don't know, cleaning out barns and spreading manure was just as much fun for me as planting corn, or I think probably my most preferred job was spraying. I'm a weed scientist by training, so an agronomist, so spraying herbicides was my ultimate favorite thing to do. But manure spreading was second. And so anything that got me out in the field was good enough for me. And see up here at the top, it says calculating the volume of animal manure produced on an agricultural operation. And again, that's tough, isn't it? I knew how much went out in those piles, but how much was there when we got around to spreading it? How much were we putting on each field? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But just knowing how much comes out of the tail end of an animal and ends up in that stockpile or in that lagoon that's available for usage. And again, you can see it's expressed in animal units. 1,000 pounds is an animal unit. A beef cattle is kind of the standard animal unit, I guess you'd say, closest to 1,000 pounds as you can get. The rest of them are just proportions of that. And you can see a dairy cow is larger, so it's 75.75 animal units, right? Hens are much smaller, so 250 hens makes a 1,000-pound animal unit. But you look over here, you can also see tons per animal unit, quite a variability in per animal unit, per 1,000-pound animal unit, quite a variability in tons of manure produced. Okay, and that has a lot to do with bedding, species differentiation, diets, metabolism, all that kind of plays into there. So that, even though you have the same number of animal units or potentially the same quantity of animal units, per ton per animal unit, we have quite a variability. Pullets produce, under 3 months, produce 8 tons per animal unit, and dairy cows produce 15, almost twice as much, okay? We got a lot more bypass feed going through a dairy cow to get that milk, that lactation, than we do in a broiler. It goes back to feed efficiency and bulk amount of feed that goes through the animal. Factors that cause variation in plant nutrient levels, we're talking about the nutrient levels in the manure available for plants. And there's great variability in that, and we know that. You put horse manure on, you get a different response than you put broiler litter versus a nice wet beef cow lot. So you got different responses because they have great variations in those nutrient levels. And that's the reason why we do planting again. We look at that, we want to do sampling, and we'll talk about the sampling. We want to know exactly what the value is of that. So we can, just like the fertilizer bag, ascribe a NPK value and other values to these manures for all the nutrients that are in them. So we can take a look at manure nutrient content, variation by species, and we can see that looking at N, P, and K, total N and phosphorus, P2O5 and K2O for potassium. And you can see that with certain of the different types of manure from the different types of animals, broiler, turkey, layer, horse, swine, and dairy, quite a variability in total N produced on a per ton basis, pounds per ton of total N. So dairy, 28 pounds, broiler, almost twice that much. Horse, only 9 pounds, typically on a dry bedded horse, horse manure, fairly fresh. So this would be utilization, and this is basically talks about this idea of feed efficiency, bypassing NPK, going through the system. Maybe only 50% actually is used by the animal for feed efficiency, for growth, okay, or maintenance. And the rest of it is going right through the animal. So all that manure is, again, that's a lot of value. All that feed we put in there, wasn't cheap, right? We paid for that. So we should think about that manure, at least 50% of that value needs to be recaptured and put back in the field, and we truly are recycling. I like to think farmers were the first environmentalists. They understood these issues before anyone came along to tell them. We could see these responses. We knew that manures were valuable right from the beginning, and we started putting them in the fields and recycling those nutrients because we know animals and feed efficiencies aren't that good. So we can see that into play. Now, so we get to this manure, and manure sampling. And I know Josh McGrath probably did a pretty good job with you yesterday, didn't he, on manure sampling? To get good representative samples, 12 is the magic number, and probably 5 is sufficient. And if you do a good job in randomizing it, and different things like that, he probably discussed that with you, the scientific ins and outs. But manure sampling is very key because if you take a sample from any one of these things, lagoons, stockpiles, dry lots, or what have you, if you take any of those and they don't represent what truly is put in the spreader and put in the field, really, and maybe it is just icing on the cake. Maybe you really don't have a feel for how much you're putting out there that's available for the plants. And so the goal is not to look at it as that icing on the cake, but really think of it as, hey, I'm going to reduce my fertilizer bill, or I'm going to make sure I balance my nutrient management plan correctly. So that's where we're at, I think, with this. So sampling, testing that, find out, can be dramatically different for the typical types of manures that we might be dealing with. And again, it's going to be practice that allows you to get a truly representative sample. And if I would have had time, I would have taken about 90% of those words out of that slide. But I didn't have time to do that for you. So next time around, hopefully I'll have time maybe to do that for you. The manure sampling, but that's for your reading pleasure later on as you're studying for your exam that's coming up. And keep in mind, this exam is pretty tough. Has anyone heard that? Maybe some of you even attempted it once. It's not an easy exam. I got a certified crop advisor's exam, and a number of PhDs at good universities don't pass that exam. Okay, and they always say that the regulations and nutrient management is some of the toughest parts. Okay, that's just a little scare there to make you study and read all these fine words that are in some of these slides later on. So manure sampling, just real quick, because I know you went over this. I just want to kind of think a little bit about it in manure handling. Sampling semi-solid lot manures, again, you can see that there's a lot of manure out there. I don't know if that's on asphalt or concrete. It's probably just earth, but you're going to scrape off that manure. That's got a great burden of manure in there. And again, collect about 2 pounds of manure, and they always tell you non-metallic containers, so plastic buckets, and keep away from storing the manures because of the acidity and anything that's metal. It'll certainly skew the results and mess with the some availabilities, like if you use aluminum, of course, that would affect phosphorus greatly. So again, very important to use plastic for that storage. And so if we're going to collect from that lot, take it right out of the loaded spreader. So you scrape that off, and then you've got a nice homogenized load. You do a good job of homogenizing. So you go right into the spreader and take your representative sample grabs out of that spreader. And if you do that enough times, and you can truly send that to the lab and get a good report that has value to you. So I think that's really critical. The collect manure from storage. Again, if it's liquid storage and it's got a crust on it, you don't take the crust. Okay, go down below the crust, or you agitate and you break the crust, and then you get a true representation of that from the storage. So much as you can homogenize that. There are, of course, under tanks, liquid tanks underneath, and they typically sampling with a conduit pipe's a good way. It's nice if you can agitate that system, put that slurry into full suspension, and then go ahead and make your draws up through this under tank system here, manure pit system. And again, use a non-metallic, basically a conduit, piece of plastic conduit, And you can push it down into liquid, put your hand over the top and draw it up out, right? Put a cork in or something like that, draw it up out, and then let it go into a bucket. And so that's one way to do that. And again, at least 1 quart at 5 or more locations in that would, if it's agitated and you're getting good representation of what's in there, and then you probably could have a pretty good value of what the whole tank has as far as nutrient value. Okay. Exterior storage, same thing. If you can, at that lagoon picture that we showed you on the dairy farm, we could put a stinger out there and we could put that whole thing in suspension. The whole 2-acre lagoon, 2.5-acre lagoon could get stirred. It's pretty amazing to watch that thing go into a whirlpool, but you can do that when you put a tractor on it, 140 horsepower tractor all day on a big stinger that's reaching out 60 feet. And then put that into the field. So you grab that grab when you get that slurry suspended. So you suspend as much of that small solid as you can to get out through that irrigation reel. So however you're going to pump out is at the level that you're going to want to agitate. Okay? So anyone done that with lagoons? Agitated lagoons and pumped out? Yeah, so, the idea is to get that fully blended, kind of like a milkshake that you really want consistency in. And if you get that, then you just let it go through the reel, and you'll just see that you get a very nice uniform effect in the field. Very, very uniform effect in the field. And, of course, you grab your samples out of it when it's in that condition. Again, here's a good picture of a lagoon that can be agitated. They just have a pump there right now, but you can also put one of those badger we call them stingers. I don't know what they call them now, but they're big agitators that would reach out even longer than that pump, get out here and really start swirling that whole lagoon, especially if it's circular. You can make that lagoon just start churning from end to end. And so especially, that's, like I say, that's probably an acre lagoon there too. So we had about a 2-acre lagoon. We were able to get a 2-acre lagoon moving with an earthen bottom and get it in a good suspension. And if you do that, then you're going to, like I say, you're going to have a very good representative sample to use when you're developing your nutrient management plan. Also, you're going to get a lot of that phosphorus and potassium that has settled out in those solids, as well as a lot of nitrogen too. So again, you're really going to increase the amount of product in that lagoon water. For the lagoon, place a small bottle, again non-metallic, half pint on a 10-foot pole, and reach out there and have fun around the lagoon, getting your sample off the manure pond. We call them manure ponds. I don't know. Maybe that's not the correct term. But if you get, again, don't want to get the scum or the brush. You want to submerge the bottle at least a foot in that liquid column. And they do have some pretty interesting systems where you can actually slide the lid back when you get it to the depth you want close. So you got some interesting ways of grabbing that sample. Of course, litter in the broiler and litter, and this would also be true for bedded pack manures, unless you were using straw or soybean hulls or sawdust in bedded pack, or from a large stockpile where you've done a lot of clean outs, and like we said, we had about a 600-ton stockpile on the backside of the farm and another 200 or 300-ton stockpile to spread spring and fall. So that's you can get good representation from them as long as you homogenize those stacks and do a good job, or take the grabs right off the floor or right out of the spreader that you or area that you've collected. Again, looks like 5 samples is the magic number, Joe. I don't know why 5 is the magic number, but I know in soil testing it was always 12 randomized samples, but they said 5, maybe because people object to pulling manure samples more than they object to pulling soil samples. But the magic number is 5, and if you're doing soil sampling, it's 12. But that 5 doesn't mean anything if it's not truly random and truly represents the pile, or the pile hasn't been homogenized. So, we tend to gravitate towards areas that are different. Anyone ever notice that? So that's why I say the more you blend that pile, get the loaders out there, what have you, and shape those piles and blend them, turn them, the better that sample is going to be, the more valuable that sample will be to you. Oh boy, this is the fun part, the land application of manure. And so we realize at that point you should be thinking dollar bills and making money. When you start thinking about putting manure out there, this is where you really should be thinking about, man, I'm finally going to make some money here. I'm going to put this nutrient out here. And it's not just icing on the cake. I know exactly what it's worth. And I know exactly the nutrient composition in it. And now I'm going to reduce my fertilizer bill. And you should just be smiling and singing the whole time. that you're out there working in this manure. And if you're not, then you need to adjust your attitude a little bit and start smiling and singing the next time you're out there in the manure handling arena. And keep in mind that when we think about these land, we got these environmental concerns, but we want to provide adequate nutrient levels for the crop. We don't want to, we don't want to just more is better. Continue to put over quantities of manure out there. We really start thinking about balancing approaches. And again, avoiding those over excessive applications of nutrients. And again, we got to keep in mind that eutrophication problems, that phosphorus and nitrogen going into our water systems, mainly phosphorus, causing those algal blooms. And I've lived on the bay my whole life, and it's changed a lot. I know it's not just farmers that are overburdened in the bay with nutrients, but we have a nutrient problem. And it's a people problem just as much as it is an animal problem. But nutrients have to be recycled. And I know you got a speaker here talking about biosolids. That's very important too. But manure has to be looked at as equally as important. Manure is, again, managed to provide, mainly, typically, we think of only NP and K when we make manure applications. That's certainly the bulk quantity of product, but we should go beyond that, I think, and I'll show you some slides to think about that. But that's what we're typically doing when we write nutrient management plans, is we're focusing on NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, the 3 fertilizer elements on the bag. That's really what we're concerned about, really having good knowledge of. Okay? And but I'm going to tell you that that's not the only thing to worry about. There's other nutrients in there that are very important. We'll look at some slides. But it's a fairly simple matter to determine these the content of these, especially P and K. Nitrogen is where it gets tricky. Okay, and we'll look at a number of slides to kind of explain that, why nitrogen is such a complicated nutrient, and it really is. But phosphorus and potassium, pretty straightforward. Quantities in the manure, portion of it that's quite available over time, and again, nitrogen availability becomes much more complicated. Yeah. But before we go there, there's 16 essential plant nutrients. Everyone remember that? Anyone have Agronomy 101? And carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, hey, they're free, right? But they make up the bulk of that product. Remember that we talked about organic matter, that first slide we looked at? Organic matter is a very important reason why we want to use manures, green manures, soil crops. Think about those residues as having value. It's because of a lot of that carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, and mainly that carbon. Okay, carbon is essential for all life. Anything that's alive has carbon, that I know of. And maybe something simple that doesn't have it, but there's almost anything we're associated with life with that has carbon. It comes from the sun through photosynthesis mainly. And but we have these minerals, and we have the primary, we're going to call them macros, and then we have the secondary minerals too. So we have nitrogen, the NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, right there where every plants really need quite sufficient quantities. They need fairly large quantities, pounds per acre, and maybe hundreds of pounds per acre, or at least 100 pounds or plus. And secondary nutrients, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, very important. Extremely important in leafy greens, calcium. Okay, sulfur is 10-to-1 ratio to nitrogen. So, we know we need sulfur. So these are our secondary nutrients. And these two are aligning nutrients, calcium and magnesium. And again, micronutrients that we get from manure that we typically pay extra when we buy fertilizer. You buy a fertilizer and it has micronutrient complex, you're going to pay a lot. Anyone buy vegetable fertilizer with micronutrients in it? It's substantially more. If you're in the turf, ornamental, or vegetables, you're going to buy fertilizers like Oyster Clark that have micronutrients in it, micronutrient enhanced. How about the Peters Professional Solutions and the Miracle Grows? They all have these micronutrients because they're essential to plant growth. Iron, manganese, boron, molybdenum, copper, zinc, chlorine. You get all those in manure, okay, because they're all part of life, the living system of animals, and they need all those just like we do for life. The only thing plants need, the only thing animals need is only a couple of iodine and selenium. About the only thing that animals need to add to their diet beyond this list. Okay, and there's a few other things too, but those are the two that are probably pretty important. Well, over the years when I was at the dairy farm, from 89 to 97, I actually developed. It wasn't mandatory, but because I got approached and said, hey, you're spending too much money in fertilizer, you got to reduce this. I said, well, I probably can reduce phosphorus, but I don't know how much. And I said, well, let's start thinking about what is the value of these manures out here. So I started in 89 through 97 every year grabbing a sample from the stockpiles twice a year and from the lagoons twice a year. Okay, and then and lo and behold, what I found is that you typically manage a farm the same way, so that you notice that it's very consistent. That manure is a very consistent product. If you handle it consistently, it's consistent in that lagoon. It's very consistent in that stockpile. We use about the same amount of bedding. We wait until it gets soiled about the same amount that we do every year. We take it out there, we pile it up in a conical pile. We might cover it, and there it is. You know, there's our stockpiles. Probably, you know, pretty close to 600 ton. Those two piles out there, homogenize them, grab samples, and lo and behold, we get pretty consistent values on a per ton pounds of nutrients, and not just the NPK, but also the calcium, magnesium. That's a lot of calcium, magnesium, you know. So again, and the micronutrients that I felt were real critical: sulfur, manganese, zinc, and copper for plant production. So again, and you can see the lagoon per 1,000 gallons. Very consistent results over that 10-year period of grabbing those nutrients. So again, if your management stays the same, and typically you get into a routine, then manure is a very consistent product. Anyone see that? Anyone agree with that? Disagree with that? I think that that's very true. And so we can expect then manures out of each individual farm to be fairly consistent over years. If we're doing everything, you know, we're not changing that management practice. Of course, manures, nutrients in manure, here's just an example of looking at poultry, looking at the micronutrient variations in the poultry, the calcium, magnesium, sulfur, sodium, iron, manganese, boron, molybdenum, zinc, copper, all as part of those 16 that we saw early on that are essential for plant growth. And you can see that we have some differences as we look down. We see some broad range differences. Pounds per ton here. Turkey is pretty close to broiler, not too far, but no, broiler is quite a bit higher in calcium. So again, probably feed and feed efficiencies and what the feed rations that are being used. We see different bypass products going through into the manure having different levels. But I bet you'd find that over 10 years, you'd find that probably the broiler house probably averaged pretty close to what you see there. Okay, if it was the same broiler, if that was, you probably find fairly good consistency. Okay, so I think these charts and tables are very good for us to help us to understand that. We can look at one for swine, and we can see, you know, the same thing, a good quantity, if you will, pounds per ton here in this figure here, in fresh hog manure of calcium, magnesium, sulfur. You know, you think about that. If we put fresh hog manure, we put 10 tons out there, that's 2 pounds of sulfur almost. That's 20 pounds of sulfur. That's all the sulfur you're going to need in a wheat crop. So you don't need to add the extra sulfur in the UAN solution when you go out and top dress your wheat. So if you're putting that manure on there, so why spend that money? You know, if you're going to put the manure, that's not icing on the cake. That's nutrients that the crop can use. There's storage and handling that may cause significant nutrient loss, especially nitrogen. So let's spend a little bit of time why this nitrogen is so tricky. And we can do a lot of things out there to capture and contain that nitrogen, to make that loss, lessen that loss. If we do simple things like covering, okay, in a stockpile, that can do a lot in trapping that ammonia loss in that manure. So again, you know, used to be where we would just put conical piles and we wouldn't take the time to cover. Who wants to do that? Anyone ever cover 600-ton stockpile? No, that's crazy. We would have scoffed and said, that's the most ridiculous thing in the world. Bring a tarp out here and cover this manure. You cover the manure. And now, you know, now we got cost share to put in manure sheds. Okay? Boy, I'm thinking, you know, that's not a bad idea. Now we don't have this soup and slop all around there. Got a nice concrete. Maybe we got cost share for 50%, 60%, maybe 80% to put up a manure structure. So again, the more these kind of things we can do, and guess what? We might still want to put plastic over top of it, even though it's inside of a storage shed, to help retain even more of those nutrients. Get more. Anyone? I guess you're all buying nitrogen, aren't you? You like paying for that nitrogen? It's crazy, isn't it? And the phosphorus and I mean, it's just unbelievable when I think about you know, trying to balance sheets now for crop production. When you just look at just the nutrients, just phenomenal. So we have some typical nutrient losses from typical differences of storage, and they're all over the place. And so, you know, we have a liquid lagoon, and it's losing 70 to 85% of the nitrogen That lagoon, gone. Okay, right up in the atmosphere, lost as ammonia. Okay, but boy, you sure can tell that when you stir it. You know, I mean, it's just wow. So it'll overcome you the amount of loss in nitrogen. Even the phosphorus and potassium in a lagoon, it's at the bottom, and so you lose it because it's not up in that suspension. So if you're not slurrying that whole lagoon and you're just taking off the liquid fraction, I mean, sure, it has value, but it doesn't have near the value it could if you stirred it. You could reduce that maybe down to 40, 50% instead of 80%. Okay, the more you stir it, the more you're going to put those fines up and make that of value to you when you spend all that money and horsepower pumping that into the field or running a slurry wagon. Again, it doesn't run, they don't run for cheap, so you want to have as much nutrients in those delivery systems as you can. And if it's all down the bottom, someday you're going to have to clean that lagoon out anyway. Boy, you talk about expense there too, right? You're going to have to drain that lagoon, and you're going to have to get someone in there with a crane, what do you call them, bucket drags, and they're going to drag all that slop out of there, and you're going to spread that, and you're going to do that for about 3 or 4 weeks. And that's going to be one of the days it's not going to be much fun. And your neighbors aren't going to think it's fun either when you do that. Okay, so if we can suspend those solids and keep those solids and get a much more uniform product, then we can reduce these losses. We can see that we don't lose as much on daily scrape and haul. 20 to 35% nitrogen loss. How about a manure pack? 20 to 40%. Clean outs maybe once or twice a year. We can get kind of in the mid-range of losses. You know, 40 to 55% of nitrogen. Lose less of the phosphorus and potassium in those systems, those drier systems. And basically because they're not fines lost down in the sedimentation layers on the lagoon. Anaerobic pits, we don't lose very much at all, really, in some of these anaerobic pits. We're using those products fairly readily, and we are typically stirring those quite well, agitating those quite well, and spreading them that way. So again, varies greatly, and of course, that varies on when you start using tables and manure calculators. You're going to see it's going to be puzzling to you maybe why there's so much differences in manures and manure values when you have them sampled and from different locations that you have them on the farm. And it does get quite puzzling, I think, at times. So again, this nutrient loss, there's manure nutrient content losses can occur due to dilution from rainwater. That's essentially true in those large open lagoons. Settling, phosphorus settles and precipitates out, and it's basically at the bottom in the sludge layer in the lagoon. And of course, gaseous loss of nitrogen. So that's how we're losing it. Okay. Again, except for lagoons, losses of P and K are relatively low. So what do? We concentrate potassium and phosphorus and potassium in these manures. So our manures then becomes a challenge because typically we probably should be going P-based instead of nitrogen-based when we make our applications. We should be looking at the phosphorus content and the potassium content to balance and then supplementing with nitrogen. A lot of farmers want to just look at the nitrogen, put that out there because that's what they readily need for that cropping year. And so they want to put as much manure out there to meet that nitrogen needs. And so when so doing, what do? They pump the phosphorus needs, or they put way too much phosphorus and potassium out there. Now, if you do that once every 5 years, that's probably not a consequence. But if you're doing that every year, because it's the closest field to the lagoon, what do you think that field's going to happen to that field over time? Well, it's going to have phosphorus levels that'll probably be 25 years trying to get them down. So that's what we're seeing in some of our fields that come close to our clean-out area. But it's amazing how much loading we can do, especially of phosphorus in soil. Potassium we typically don't load for that length of time. But that's what we do when we put these products out there that are heavier in phosphorus and potassium because of less loss over time. So we typically can look at, again, nutrient losses, different kinds of storage. We've got some different examples of storage over here. And there's typically these percent of nutrient retained factors. And so, again, a lot of manure calculations, a lot of tables, Newman, Newman Pro, the one that we use now for calculating nutrient management plans, and the nutrient management program, has these type of factors built into it. Put the manure values in, and they automatically use a lot of these different factors based upon what type of manure you choose, and to help you get a better understanding of what's really going to be available for the plant. Know what's there, we put it out there. We have a really good, by sampling, we have a really good representation. We know what we're putting in the field, but what really is available to the plant. And then we start looking at some of those factors. So factor percent of the nutrients retained in different storage systems. And we can see we might start out with 60%, the example here, poultry manure with a sawdust bed, pounds of nitrogen, 50% factor, 30 pounds available. Okay, and so that's just we could do that for any one of those. We could put 100 in there. If we put 100 in for an open feed lot, let's say that's beef, and we put 100 pounds of nitrogen available per ton, but we potentially 50% loss per ton, and then we get down to 50 pounds that might be available on that, based on our storage losses. Just again, looking at this was more on the phosphorus. We see we don't typically lose phosphorus. So anytime we see a 1 there, a value of 1, we typically don't see any losses of phosphorus or potassium, but we're losing the nitrogen, 50% of it. So that's typically what we're seeing when we look at the storage and storage losses of manure, of value. Again, lowering the P content, because we're not losing phosphorus and because it typically is the one that limits us to how much we can actually apply under nutrient management planning, what can we do to lower manure P content so that we don't have as much phosphorus in that manure to begin with? And remember, typically phosphorus, animals in our diets, and us included, a lot of phosphorus bypasses our systems too. Approximately 2/3 of the phosphorus in grains in the form of phytic acid or phytate is poorly digested in non-ruminants, especially. Okay, so hogs and ourselves and chickens, boy, that phosphorus is going right through. Okay, we just don't break it down. We just don't. So what do? They feed calcium phosphate, so they actually supplement the feed with calcium phosphate to get enough phosphorus. Especially when you're talking about brewers, they have to grow fast, don't they? It's 6 weeks. They want them to the market, 8 weeks you lose money. 6 weeks you make money. And so how do you get them the feed efficiency up? Well, you pump the phosphorus into them, okay, to make sure that their bones they're not growing faster than their body can support the growth. It basically to get as much phosphorus as in that ATP, that energy system in plants and animals, and so without it, we really can't do much in the way of accelerated growth, metabolism. And so we can see that they put calcium phosphate in there. Of course, what are we doing? We're putting more phosphorus in a feed that's already high in phosphorus, right? That's somewhat unavailable to the animal. And so what can we do? Well, typically now they're adding phytates, an enzyme that breaks down phytic acid and the phytates that we typically see in our feeds. So we don't have to add the extra calcium phosphate. Okay, we use an enzyme that helps, enzyme that's naturally in the animal, basically. We just ramp that up. So the monogastrics can actually excrete 25 to 50% less phosphorus. Okay? We reduce that phosphorus in manure. Now the nitrogen to phosphorus and P ratios are more in levels that we can deal with in manure applications. The other way we can do that is we can also bind the phosphorus in the feed by using alum. Anyone ever heard that? Aluminum sulfate, you bind it. It makes it less readily available. Not like you're putting less phosphorus out there, but you're making it less readily. So it's less readily available to lost to the environment and tied up in the soil. What time we got to go to, Joe? I'm getting pretty close, huh? Oh, good. Okay. Well, we'll have time for questions then. And that's good. So we look at nitrogen forms in manure, and we think about this organic N and inorganic N. And organic N basically is, think about all that bulk that's out there, and it's tied up in these amine groups and uric acid mainly in urea, and of course it's all combined, and basically it's somewhat unavailable, or at least it's not readily available. Something has to happen to it before it's available for plant growth. So we have this organic N bulk of the material. And then we have some that's in the inorganic form already, and that's what the plants can take up. Ammonia, nitrates, these things plants can actually readily start to use. And again, it's this inorganic N is what we're really wanting to know or have a good handle on when we talk about timing for crop uptake. And I think, when we talk about manure management, we don't want to put manure out there when plants can't utilize it. It used to be that, remember I talked about manure was a nuisance and we icing on the cake, but we also weren't really too concerned about timing of application. Whenever it was opportune time to get on the field, that was good. We didn't really think about the concept of, well, wouldn't it be nice to have the nutrients available when the plants need it? Okay? So that's kind of a novel concept, and that's what we do with fertilizer, right? When we side dress and band and all that. Well, why not start thinking about manure that way? And we got some really nice machines now that can put that manure placement, just like banding fertilizer. Okay? And so, you know, we really need to be thinking about, well, we need this nutrients. We need them, a lot of them in this organic form, especially, and we're talking about nitrogen now. It's in an organic form that plants can't use. So we have to time that so that when we apply this to the field, that as much of that nitrogen can be available as available. We got to start thinking a little bit about, okay, if I put this manure out here, and most of it is organic in, there has to be some mineralization, there has to be some breakdown to get it into this inorganic form. Okay? And what's the difference between organic and inorganic? Well, this is the question. This is not a trick. We talked about it earlier. Organic contains carbon, right? So when we talk about inorganic forms, basically we're talking about salts, chemical salts, compounds without carbon, okay, without carbon. If it's tied up in a carbon form, it's not very readily available. It's going to have to come out of that carbon form before it's readily available. Then it's inorganic. Then it's the salts, the fertilizers that we're commonly thinking about when we make fertilizer applications. So we have this thing called mineralization that has to occur with that organic nitrogen, that nitrogen in the organic form. It has to go through this process of mineralization. And again, this mineralization factor is different at different times of the year, winter top dress, spring or fall, perennial grass systems, depending on the biological activity. Biological activity, temperature, all those kind of come into play when we talk about mineralization. So we want to time these applications then when we can get the most mineralization. Spring and early fall. 35% of our organic N can potentially be mineralized, okay? If in a perennial grass system or maybe a cropping system. Swine and poultry, look at poultry, 60% spring and fall, but look how low, half of it in the winter. So do we want to put manure out in the winter? It really doesn't make any sense. They do it a lot in areas where it's arid. Why would they do it in areas where it's arid? Out in the Midwest where they don't get any rainfall, it's just snow. They can load up everything they want to put in the fall, and they typically put it in the deep freeze until next spring. Okay, and they don't get typically enough heavy rains. It's usually snowfall. So at that point, so in the northern Great Plains, they can put all their fertilizers on in the fall and probably not lose any of it. Very little of it. But that's not the case here. But we put the fertilizer on, or we put the manure on this time of the year, or in the winter of the year, and we get 6 inches of rain, and the ground's not froze, or maybe worse yet, it is froze, and we put it on top. Where's it going? Okay, it's not going to go in the ground. It's not going to stay there. No, it's gone. Okay, especially anything that's soluble is gone. So look at these mineralization rates, organic nitrogen, and we think about different, certainly different between species again, and again, it's much different in the growth times of the years. At least 50% more available, okay, when the plants need it. That's where our manure application should be near to that time period. Okay, it makes no sense to put it on in the winter period. It'd be much better off staying in the stockpile and then put it out there when there's good microbial activity, good time for plant uptake. Availability of N, again, looking at organic N and the inorganic N, and again, we typically, as we look at these values, we're going to look at both. We're going to see a value when we get a manure data sampling data back from the lab, and it's going to tell us how much organic N we have and how much inorganic N we have. What's readily available and what will be available over time is what we're looking at. And we can see a lot there, dry poultry, 77% is the organic N. That means it might not be readily available, or we have to consider how fast that's going to mineralize. Remember we talked at 60, I think it was 60%, so it mineralizes pretty fast. So maybe it's a good timing process, kind of a slow release process of N for that cropping system. Okay, and I think that anyone use poultry litter on corn? Looks pretty good, doesn't it? I think because we're seeing mineralization rates work about the same growth rate of that corn plant, so that basically we're spoon feeding that nitrogen that mineralizes as that plant's growing. So again, that's how much do you spend for these nitrogen nitrification reducers and the different products that we're spending a lot of money for that. Manure has that built into it. Okay, it has a slow release product, basically, or potential built right into it already. So I think that's very important. Again, looking at the differences between liquid dairy, semi-solid dairy, getting some pretty big lagoon, swine lagoon down there. We're getting some pretty big differences, almost a 1-to-1 in organic N to nitrogen or inorganic N. Again, these ratios And these ratios also, the mineralization has a lot to do with this carbon to nitrogen ratio. We're not going to get into that. But again, moisture, temperature ratio, the manures, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, all has a lot to do with availability of that nitrogen. Some of that nitrogen might get tied up in that microbial complex that has to break down that organic N into organic N products. Okay, so again, it's complex, but it can be figured out. Volatilization is probably one of the biggest losses of N as ammonia gas. So we get to ammonium, which is NH4, and then unfortunately we don't stop there, and we get a change to ammonia, and then that's a gaseous loss if it's not in the soil. So incorporation is very important to mitigate against ammonium to ammonia gas loss. The urea undergoes the same kind of a system where urease is involved, and we see a urea molecule, which is carbon-based molecule, breaks off by the urease enzyme into ammonia, okay, and carbon dioxide. So again, the urea, a compound, and we have some of these urease inhibitors now to slow that process down, so we don't lose that have that ammonia loss so great. We look at effective method of volatilization on just a couple examples here of nitrogen availability. We got semi-solid, liquid, lagoon, and dry. And we can see what happens when we see an injection. We can get 95% availability with injection systems. Broadcast immediately with incorporation, we can see that maybe we only get 3/4 for some of these, some products, where with dry litter, maybe 90% with fairly immediate incorporation. But we start waiting for incorporation, and we start to have, from volatilization issues, ammonia gas, losses ammonia, we see that we get down and we start losing, after 7 days, a substantial part, maybe 75% of it can be lost. That nitrogen that would be subject to volatilization loss by going into ammonia, from ammonium to ammonia, or from urease, uric acids into urease, into ammonia. So then, what do we do about it? Well, they've come up with a system called PAN, okay? And remember, the others are straightforward, but nitrogen is the one that's complex, isn't it? But PAN is the plant available nitrogen, calculating plant available nitrogen. Using laboratory manure analysis, calculate the plant available nitrogen. And that's what you're going to see quite a bit, maybe even on exams. You're going to see it when you're actually doing manure balancing. They're going to talk about this plant available nitrogen, PAN. The amount of nitrogen available to crops during the first year following the application of manure. That's what you're worried about. You're worried about the life of that crop in the field, what's going to be available from this manure application to that particular crop. Plant available nitrogen for that particular plant for that growing season, and it's going to be the sum of the total inorganic nitrogen, the ammonium fraction that we typically see in the lab report, and the percent of organic nitrogen that will mineralize during the growing season. So basically it's the sum of those two. We're going to calculate how much of it is going to be available for mineralization based on those mineralization charts, and they're built into those manure calculators. Formerly, up until this year, after 6 days, we basically said that all the ammonium, if it was put on the surface, this would be no-till on the surface, not incorporated. After 6 days, we zeroed it out. There's no longer any concern for the ammonium fraction of that. But that's not true anymore. Okay? That's not true. Recent research, Dr. Jack Messenger from USDA did some really good controlled research in the field right over here at Beltsville, and came up with a new concept that, guess what? In no-till systems, after 3 days, we go down fairly rapidly to about 50% of the ammonia. But guess what? That ammonia gas interacts with the soil. Soil is porous, okay? And gas, it's heavier than air, can go down and interact in those pores and actually become bound to the clays and the humus and to the root zones and root tissues and all the different biological life that's going to grab that nitrogen too, because it's hungry for it. Remember, nitrogen is a limiting system. in most of our soil systems. So everything's hungry for it. So lo and behold, we don't zero out anymore. We go down to 45%. And we kind of bottom out there. Recent research has shown that we don't lose all of it, even if we don't incorporate. I think that's a plus for no-till. I'm a no-till farmer. I love no-till production. And I think this is great because that means that we don't have to do all this tillage and injection. We're still getting quite a bit of that nitrogen that could be available in these no-till or reduced-till systems. Okay? I never did like that other chart that said we zeroed it out in 6 days. To tell you the truth, I never believed it. But I never liked it either. Because I saw responses that showed that nitrogen was still there and still available. But we do see a difference. Now that previous slide, hey, bump back there real quick, was, let's see, that's liquid manure. Doesn't tell you the species. And this one we see down to a 35% of the original that we started with for manures, for solid manures and organic residual. So again, 10% dry matter, 90% moisture. We see ammonia losses down to, we retain about 1/3 of the ammonia after the 3-day period if we're going no-till. And then we stay there. That's been captured in the soil, interaction with the soil and the microbial life there at the surface. So, poultry, look at that. 3/4 of it is actually, because it's in ammonium and nitrate form, fairly readily available to react to this ammonium form. 3/4 of it is actually captured by the soil, even if we don't incorporate. But this is after 14 days, they still showed that 3/4 of it was still there. So it really did, in a gaseous form, interact with that soil profile. And that's probably going to vary on soil cover, residue, microbial action, time of the year, temperature, all those things that we talked about earlier is going to have some bearing on that. But during the growing season, when manure should be applied, Jack Messenger's work is showing that, hey, we're getting quite a bit of this substantial recovery of some of these products, even though we're not injecting or tilling in. I think that's great knowledge to have. So we use laboratory manure analysis then to calculate manure application rates and to require mainly to meet a specific nutrient requirement for a crop. Okay, so that's really what when we talk about the whole thing now, that's really what we're talking about when we develop a nutrient management. We're going to take the manure analysis, we're going to then calculate what rate we need to put out in the field, and then how we're going to meet that nutrient requirement. Well, I thought this was kind of interesting. Anyone go online, Purdue has a kind of a neat manure calculator, so you can kind of plug in. This was actually done by a colleague up in, where does it say? You want to see where it says? Yeah, Washington County, Maryland. So it's probably just similar up in Washington County. He probably plugged this in for breeding heifers, and this is right from the manure sheet, the analysis sheet that he got back, 16.6 total N, 14.2, and this is pounds per ton of ammonium, the N, the inorganic, and the organic, P2O5, K2O, dry matter percent, and then they punch out availability for the first year, basically what we're talking about, plant available nitrogen. And I think that's kind of neat that you can kind of do these things fairly simply. So you got the manure report, you really don't want to go into Newman and develop a whole plan, you just want to kind of run a calculator. And that was actually supported by some of our literature, a book we talked about here, Maryland Department of Agriculture, COMAR. So they built that on the COMAR from Maryland. Okay, so you plug in any county in Maryland, and it's going to use the regulated quantities and things that Maryland has, rich soils and for its site characteristics. Wow, spreading equipment. Now we're really getting into the fun stuff. It's time to get out there and spread. And we've got the stockpile, we got the manure analysis in hand, we're told how many tons we should be putting on the acre. Now we got to actually get out there and do it. And as you get working with farmers, you're going to have to go out and maybe help them try to figure out, are they putting on 8 ton, 12 ton, 15 ton, 25 ton? They have no clue unless they've actually done some calibration, okay, or got some pretty good scales or a hydraulic. I always like the hydraulic indicator, weight indicators on the buckets. You ever seen those? They're pretty good. You can put a gauge on there, and you can, just by pressure, you can get a pretty good estimation of how much weight you have in that bucket. How many buckets then goes in the spreader. Of course, you run across the scales. Or you can start doing, and we'll talk about how we calibrate these spreaders. But also making good spreader applications. When should an application of manure fertilizer be applied? And do I need a nutrient management plan? Well, the last one we can answer that, right? In Maryland, yes. Okay. And When should it be applied? Well, we want to time it to the best possible time period for that crop to utilize it. Again, getting a good even distribution out there is not easy. I know a number of you have spread manure. And what do you think? Stand back and you say you did a good job that day, or wind's blowing 30 miles an hour and say, the job wasn't too good that day. So we really need to be thinking about, doing a nice job. Nice, even, thorough, very well calibrated delivery of this. And so that's always important. There's a lot of techniques that we can talk about to do that. Certainly calibration and adjustment. Any piece of equipment, what's the most important item a farmer should take to the field for equipment adjustment? There's a clue right there. Operator's manual, especially if it's a new piece of equipment. And I've seen sometimes I think some of the consultants need to see the operator manual, and maybe you have read a little bit about some of these things before they go out into the field, so they have a better understanding. But yeah, we get out there, we can set a machine to do what we want to do, set it for the field conditions. How fast can we possibly take this manure spreader across the field? What happens if it's not doing what it's supposed to do? Well, why don't we just stop? For crying out loud. Maybe we've got a semi-slurry on a spreader, and maybe we need a tailgate in there, okay? Because we're really not spreading, okay? So there's a lot of things that we need to do, or maybe we ought to wait till that stuff freezes up a little bit. Maybe we can spread it. No, you can't do that. Not anymore, right? But the idea is that it gets challenging out there to make this machinery do what we want it to do and handle all the different bedding types. And a lot of times it might be we need jobbing attachments on there. Maybe we do need a slurry gate to put on that manure spreader. Maybe it's time to trade that manure spreader in and get one that can handle a semi-solid manure and do a nice job of making application. So we got these three methods of calibrating. Now, did you talk about this? Did Josh teach this? He didn't talk about this? Okay. The TARP method, the swath and distance method, and the load per field method. Okay, so we're going to kind of dissect those three methods. Again, TARP method, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. We're going to go out in the field, and we're going to put these tarps out. Okay, we're going to run the manure spreader over it, right? And then we're going to have some fun as we gather up these tarps and weigh how much we got in there. I don't know. I've never done that with a farmer. Has anyone ever done that? Oh, all right. Trish says I guess there's a lot of fun there. Huh? I'm sure there has to be a lot of fun. I'm sure. And so anyway, get them to do that, but really, it is a good task to do, especially when you get a new piece of equipment and you're dealing maybe with a bedding type of manure change. This is the most accurate method, I think, that you can do to actually do a good job of assessing and calibrating that manure spreader. So getting out there, we do it with fertilizer. Why shouldn't we do it with manure? We get out there, we're going to place these plastic sheets on the ground. We're going to run the manure spreader, the speed and the RPM, PTO, right at PTO speed, how fast we're going to make that delivery, where we think we're going to be in the ballpark, maybe based on the book or based on actual experience. And then we're going to come out and we're going to weigh how much is in that collected tarp, which then is a representation of an acre. Okay? And so it works actually pretty good with different tarp dimensions. You know, some people might say, well, why would I want to use a 10 by 12 when I can use a 6 by 6? And it's based on bulk density and the amount of quantity of the product that you're going to spend out there as to what tarp dimension that you might want to use. But you can see pounds of waste collected in a 6 by 6 equates, if you collected 15 pounds, it equates to 9 tons. Okay, so if you spread a 6 by 6 sheet of plastic out in the field, you run a spreader across the field, did a nice job of putting it in the collection pathway, got a nice good representation, and you weighed that and you got 15 pounds in that 6 by 6, then it would represent 9.08 tons per acre. Maybe that's where we want to be, or maybe it's not where we want to be. Maybe it's less than we want to be. We want to have 15 tons, so we need to increase our speed by, what, 30% or 40%. So, again, knowing that is pretty good knowledge. I mean, that's a good starting point to get to where we want to be. Okay? Now, you also notice that what happens when you have a 10 by 12 and you collect 15 pounds? It goes down, right? Okay, so it's kind of an inverse relationship, the size of the tarp, because it's a representation of acreage. So the larger, the more accurate you're going to be, and the less material, the same amount of material represents less per acre basis. Also, another way to do this is divide the number of pounds so we can get to actual tons per acre applied divide the number of pounds of manure collected in the area in the tarp. The result will be pounds of manure per square foot. Once we have the per square foot number, once we know how many pounds of manure are in a square foot, so we can use any size capture system, basically. Calibrated to a square foot, we multiply by 21.78. That's like a constant. That once you know that, 21.78, or you just refresh yourself by looking at a slide like this, that as long as you know the pounds per square feet, then 21.78 is the constant that you multiply pounds per square feet to equal tons per acre. Okay? And there's an example here. You collected 8.8 pounds on a 64 square foot area, which is that 8 by 8 area. It represents 0.1375 pounds per square feet, and you want to carry the decimal place like that, probably out to about 4 places to get as much accuracy as you can, and then you multiply that 0.1375 times 21.78, our constant, and it gives you 3 tons per acre. So this 8.8 pounds on that 8 foot, if we look back at that previous slide, would have been about 3 tons per acre. So we can use a table, or we can actually use, if we have any size area that we're collecting, it could be a pan for that matter. Put several 1 foot square pans out there and multiply it by 27.8. The swath is interesting. It's another way of measuring. The swath basically might work very well for a manure spreader or maybe a slurry application or what have you. Might be a good way to capture that. The direct measurement, again, weighing and converting the volume measurement rated by bushels or cubic foot capacities. So your spreader holds 7,000 pounds of manure, 3.5 tons. Your application width is 35 feet. You travel 1,200 feet along the field to empty the load. And so basically then we use a formula there, 7,000 pounds, 42,000 square feet. Is that 12 times 35? Give you that area, which is pretty close to an acre, isn't it? 43,560 is an acre. So that's pretty much an acre. 7,000 pounds almost on a per acre basis. 0.167 pounds per square feet. Once we get that pounds per square feet number, we just use the constant 21.78 to get our 3.63 tons per acre. And again, when we have it calculated that well, calibrated that well, we really do know just about like if we spread fertilizer, our efficiency of that product in the field. Another way, and this is probably the farmer method, is you just load the spreader, right? And you kind of have an idea how much you put in the spreader. The spreader is a 6-ton spreader or an 8-ton spreader. The book says it holds this based on cubic feet, maybe density measurements, moisture measurements. So you get an idea of how much is in there. Maybe you use a hydraulic instrument on the loader bucket that tells you how much you're putting in each bucket load. Maybe you know it's a yard, and you can representatively weigh a sample and know what proportion of a yard that is. But anyway, try to know how much is in you're putting into that manure spreader. And then, so you kind of have a ton value, size of the field, number of acres, and number of loads. Okay, so very simple, probably the most tried and true farmer method out there. It probably can be pretty accurate over time if you're doing a good job assessing the quantity that's in the spreader. Okay, so that's some farmers are pretty good at that and some aren't. Okay, and that's where good calibration, I think, comes in to kind of verify that. But anyway, 35 loads, 3.5 tons per load. 122.5 tons, 55 acres, 2.23 tons per acre. So again, and if you had the manure delivered, and let's say you had broiler litter brought out to this area from the eastern shore, and they told you, hey, we ran across the truck scales, that's how much you have. And if you knew we had a 10-acre field and you spread that on a 10-acre field, you could have that calculation pretty well as to what the quantity was to the true value. The drawback with this load per field method is typically you make the spreading first, right? You do the spreading operation, and then you step back and you, well, how much did I put on there? Is that following the nutrient management plan? Not really. That's not the ideal method when it comes to making the application according to the nutrient management plan. We need to have a calc. Now, if you did a small area, let's measure off this acre. We're going to make sure we're going to calibrate correctly on that acre. We weighed our product very carefully. And then made the acre spread before we did the 100. Then I say, yeah, you did that appropriately and did a good job. Well, I think that's it. I'm done, wrapped up pretty early for you. I know we went through those slides. First time I've done this presentation, so I really didn't know how long it would take to go through all that verbiage. I skipped most of it, didn't I? So you can thank me for that. Any questions? We do have some time about manure handling. Sure, we can go back to any slides that you'd like to go back to, too. But yes. Oh, yes. Let me get the mic. There's a button here at the bottom. It's on the bottom.
You talked about the nutrients settling in the lagoon and
Yes.
cleaning the lagoon out. And is the testing of the sediment in the bottom of the lagoon part of the normal process for preparing the plant? I mean, logistically, is that something?
Yes, it should be. The manure should be tested. There's no doubt about that. And those sludge that's at the bottom of the lagoon or even a clean-out tank, when you finally do clean that out, I would say yes, send that to a lab. That's high phosphorus and potassium and potentially nitrogen. So, yeah, you want to know what's in those anaerobic pits.
So what's the technical method for getting down there and getting the...
Well, what I would do is it's going to come out, and they're probably going to put some plastic sheeting down, or they're going to pick a nice armored area or what have you, and they're just going to scoop that out of the pond, and it's going to take up over here and drain off. And you're going to be either loading it right away, cleaning it out and spreading it, which I would recommend, or you're going to let it set and then load it, let it dry a little bit. But it's a terrible smell, so I'd say you pick a day. When you do that operation, it's not going to, a large lagoon is going to take several days. And so to get that lagoon cleaned out, thankfully it only needs to be done about once every 10, 12 years. But when it's done, it's a substantial job. Anyone been through that? I've been through it at least once.
So when you managed the lagoon at the dairy, what you routinely spread wasn't the sludge, it was the stuff, let's say the top.
And as much of it as we could get into suspension with the stinger.
Okay.
So we would try, like I said, we could get that whole 2.5 acre lagoon churning, a big whirlpool.
Did it get to the point at the end where it was just too thick to pump?
We would have a little problem. Fortunately, the real type gun irrigation system that we had could handle quite a bit of solid. So we never had much problem with it. But occasionally we would have the thing pause. So we just had to watch it. You know about how long it took for that reel to come in. So you paid attention to it. And then it would. But I never saw it give us much trouble.
Okay.
And, we get into
There are cases, though, where people can't agitate their lagoons.
That's exactly right.
We have unagitated lagoons in Maryland.
Right. Most of them probably are.
Yeah, and the best way to sample that, in my opinion, is to put out some, I call them, I think they're called buffet pans. They're fairly large. Put them out where you know the stuff's going to get spread. Sample it. So, yeah, it's after the fact, but at least you can adjust your plan. You'll have that information.
And as the sediment fills up in the lagoon, remember, you want to take the water, you want to take what you're pumping on the field. You don't want to shove that sample down into that sediment-rich. It's not going to be a very good representation of what you're actually putting in the field, if you're not agitating that lagoon.
Yeah, scooping the top stuff off an unagitated lagoon doesn't make any sense at all.
Or going down too deep
true.
in a suspended sediment layer. Yeah. But a lot of rainwater, of course, that's in the dairy operation, that's flushing off the loafing shed area, the feedlot area. Even the milk and parlor area typically flows down in those lagoons. And so you get a lot of manure going into there. And they're fully contained. There's no outflows on a lagoon. And so these are lined. So it really is just a storage area of manure and the liquid that you capture in that area. And, of course, you're losing a lot of that nitrogen. And we saw that, how much of that loss is. But we're retaining most of that phosphorus and potassium. And if we can put that into suspension, we can pump that into the field. We want a true representation, though, of what we're actually taking out of that lagoon at the time of pump out. And it's good to do it regularly, because then you pretty much, like I say, you pretty much know when you put that stinger out there and circulate that lagoon, what's going to come up as far as values is going to be fairly consistent. Questions about manure? How many of you are going to enjoy manure more? That's a quest. And so I've always enjoyed manure and corn silage and all those things. And sometimes I've been removed for 13 years now with extension. Sometimes I miss it. So there's something for you to ponder. But I appreciate everyone's attention to this morning, and a pretty good first session, I hope. And hope that you've got a little more appreciation about the complexities of using manure as a nutrient, but also the real benefits of taking the time to use that. And nutrient management, I think farmers, typically when they learn some of these things, and they see the value and they see the reduction in fertilizer bills, they're going to come around to it. I don't know if some of you are from different states and maybe you're just starting the process of nutrient management planning. And there's some bulk to this, as far as farmers bulking. to do this. They kind of see it as you're controlling my operation, but I think deliver it to them in such a way as I'm gonna make you money. They'll listen. They'll learn. They'll find out how valuable it really is. Yeah, thank you.